They witnessed highs and lows that could serve as the plot for dozens of epic sagas. They survived Napoleon when all of Europe trembled under the boots of his armies. They were at the helm of the Austro-Hungarian Empire when it found itself at the epicenter of World War I. And they saw their own empire collapse under the weight of new world orders. They watched as the USSR became a superpower and then fell apart into pieces. They endured the long years of the Cold War, when the world stood precariously on the very edge of nuclear apocalypse, and witnessed firsthand how the Europe they once united under their influence became something entirely different. Their experience is not just history, it's a living memory of how empires are born, reach the height of their power, and then disappear into the depths of time. And now, looking at modern Russia, they say bluntly, Russia's finished. The Hapsburgs. Why are their words not just an opinion, but a verdict handed down by history itself? What do the Hapsburgs know about the collapse of empires? What is Putin missing? And why does their experience say Russia is on the edge? This isn't criticism, it's a warning to Russians. If you aren't able to start making changes in your country right now, those changes will come for you themselves and drag your face across the gravel. Watch until the end, because this isn't just a video, it's a history lesson that's repeating itself before our eyes. And if even the Habsburgs say that Russia is finished, then that's how it is. Ahead, you'll find unexpected facts, historical parallels, and the answer to the main question. Why is Putin finished? But first, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell to get notifications about new videos. Don't forget to like and leave comments. By doing so, you help promote this video. And if you want to support the creator, check out Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. All the links are in the description and the first comment. The Habsburgs aren't just a family name. They're a legend. Their story begins in the 10th century, when a modest count from Switzerland named Radbod decided that his family would rule the world. And you know what? He actually pulled it off. Thanks to clever marriage alliances, diplomacy, and of course, military power, the Habsburgs became the most powerful dynasty in Europe. Their motto was simple: let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. And marry they did. Their marriages were a weapon that worked better than any army. One of the most famous examples is the marriage of Mary of Burgundy and Maximilian I. As a direct result of this union, the Habsburgs gained firm control over Burgundy, the Netherlands, and parts of France. Later on, their son Philip the Handsome married Joanna the Mad of Castile, a strategic union which brought them the kingdoms of Spain, Naples, and Sicily, along with vast colonies across the New World. By the middle of the 16th century, over half of the European continent was under their imperial rule. Their global empire was so incredibly vast and expansive that it was famously said that the sun never set on its territories. But the Habsburgs were not just about marriages. They were also about wars, intrigue, and diplomacy. They survived the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, and many other conflicts. They ruled the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, Spain, and even Mexico, though not for long. Their power was so great that even the Pope felt uneasy around them. But nothing lasts forever. After World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, and the Habsburgs faded into the background. But their experience and influence remained. They survived the fall of their empire, and now, centuries later, they are speaking out again. But this time, their words sound like a verdict for another empire, Russia. Who is speaking, and what exactly are they saying? You're about to find out everything. The Habsburgs' relationship with Russia has always been, let's say, complicated. They were never true friends, but they weren't open enemies either. It was a game where each side tried to outmaneuver the other. In the 19th century, for example, the Hapsburgs and Russia were allies in the fight against Napoleon. Together, they actively participated in the coalition wars, and it was their combined strategic efforts that helped halt the advance of the French emperor. But even then, the Habsburgs regarded Russia with suspicion. They understood that this country wasn't just a neighbor, it was an empire that always looked to exploit even the slightest weakness in bordering nations. Later, their interests began to diverge. Russia was actively advancing into the Balkans, which caused concern for Austria-Hungary. The Habsburgs saw how Russia was using pan-Slavism, the idea of uniting all Slavic peoples under its wing, as a tool to expand its influence. This led to tensions that eventually erupted in the Crimean War, and later on in World War I. Interestingly, the Habsburgs always regarded Russia as a young empire. With their centuries of experience, they saw that Russia was repeating the same mistakes that other empires had once made: overexpansion, internal contradictions, and an inability to adapt to change. And as history eventually showed, they were indeed right. The massive Russian Empire collapsed in the year 1917, and the Soviet USSR followed in 1991. The Habsburgs survived the fall of their own empire, but they witnessed other empires disappear from the map of the world. And now, once again, they are talking about Russia. Karl von Hapsburg, a descendant of this great dynasty, made a statement in which he called Russia a classic colonial empire and said a key phrase: Europe, if it cares about the safety of its citizens, must begin as soon as possible to develop scenarios for the collapse of Moscow's colonial empire. And that's enough to make Moscow panic. Alexander Bastrakin, who apparently now reacts reflexively to any mention of Russia's collapse, promptly and decisively rushed forward to provide a comprehensive and formal legal assessment of the statements made by the Austrian politician. Translated from the complex Russian bureaucratic language, this essentially means urgently come up with a creative way to take offense and find someone specific to blame. Who is Karl von Habsburg, and why do his words hit Moscow so hard? Karl von Habsburg is a man whose very last name is a symbol of empire. For centuries, the Habsburgs ruled a vast, multi-ethnic state that encompassed half of Europe. But unlike Russia, they managed to part ways with the colonial model and evolve into a civilized Europe. Hapsburg is not just a historical figure, but also an influential politician. He leads the pan-European movement of Austria, which actively advocates for European unity and opposes authoritarianism. In this sense, he's the perfect person to call things by their proper names. Why is Russia so afraid of discussions about its collapse? The Kremlin is used to thinking that Russia is not an empire, but a unique civilization, a special path, a triune people, and other such propaganda nonsense. But in reality, it's just an ordinary colonial construct, cobbled together from conquered peoples, where the center lives at the expense of the periphery, and any attempts at national self-determination are suppressed by force. That's exactly why the Kremlin reacts so painfully to any mention of the possibility of Russia's collapse. They know that this process is inevitable. Karl von Habsburg simply voiced what is historically obvious. Empires built on coercion do not last forever. So what happens next? If anyone in Moscow hopes they can ban discussions about the future breakup of Russia, that's about as realistic as trying to ban the force of gravity. You can open as many criminal cases as you want, take offense at the descendants of monarchs, and threaten sanctions, but that won't change reality. Russia is the last colonial empire in Europe, and its fate has long been known. It's just that the Kremlin keeps pretending they can avoid the course of history. Karl von Habsburg merely reminded them that it doesn't work that way. The Habsburgs survived the fall of the Holy Roman Empire, witnessed the collapse of the Ottoman, Spanish, Napoleonic, Russian, and German empires, saw the fall of the Soviet Union and the final dissolution of the British, French, and Portuguese colonial empires, becoming living witnesses to the fact that no empire is eternal. All of them fell under the weight of their ambitions, internal contradictions, and inability to adapt to change. Today, Russia is repeating the same mistakes. The vast Russian national economy, which for many long centuries has been accustomed to living off the extensive extraction and exploitation of natural resources, is now facing the very same curse of resource dependence that has historically brought down and doomed empires in the past. Once, Spain extracted gold from the Americas, but failed to invest in industrial development, and ultimately lost its economic influence. The Ottoman Empire maintained extensive control over trade routes, but steadfastly resisted modernizing its systems, and eventually became known as the sick man of Europe. This is a historical cliché that became associated with the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, as it gradually declined, lost territories, and became dependent on the goodwill of European powers. Now, Russia, having firmly tied its economic model to the export of oil and gas, is facing a new reality. Sanctions, embargoes, the loss of the European market, falling energy prices, and technological lag. All of these are undermining its economic foundation. Like previous empires, it stubbornly ignores the need for structural reforms, hoping that the familiar model of an endless flow of raw materials will somehow hold up. But history teaches us, when the main source of income disappears, the entire system that depended on it disappears as well. The Hapsburgs, who repeatedly went through economic crises, understand that this is the beginning of the end. Today, Russia has found itself in the very trap that doomed empires inevitably fall into: international isolation, a lack of allies, and the loss of legitimacy in the eyes of the civilized world. The great powers of the past, from the Ottoman Empire to Byzantium, collapsed not only because of military defeats, but also because they became outcasts on the international stage, losing access to economic, diplomatic, and technological resources. The Hapsburgs, who for centuries managed a complex web of alliances and treaties, knew very well that an empire survives not so much by the power of arms as by the ability to negotiate. Russia, however, blinded by the illusion of its own importance, rejected this lesson, erasing itself from world politics and turning its leaders into pariahs. But history is ruthless. Empires cut off from the outside world inevitably die, if not from enemy blows, then from internal decay. No external force can destroy an empire as effectively as its own weaknesses. Today, Russia is repeating this scenario. The Habsburgs see that without allies and international support, the empire cannot survive, and internal contradictions are a ticking time bomb that will explode sooner or later. Empires do not collapse on the day of defeat on the battlefield, not at the moment of signing a surrender, and not even when a crowd tears down their flags. They die earlier, at the moment when they become incapable of change. They resist, refuse to acknowledge reality, cling to old dogmas, until they turn into caricatures of themselves. When, under the weight of their own myth of greatness, they stop seeing reality and keep pretending to have power they no longer possess. Russia is an empire that has long since passed the point of no return, but hasn't realized it yet. It is deeply symbolic that it is the Habsburgs who are the ones delivering the verdict to Moscow. Their dynasty fought Russia for centuries, sometimes over Poland, sometimes for influence in the Balkans, sometimes for control over Europe. In the 18th century, they could still afford to see Russia as a partner, but the 19th century showed that this was a dangerous delusion. Russian pan-Slavism, expansionist policies, and aggressive imperialism became a threat to the very existence of Austria-Hungary. In the end, it couldn't withstand the pressure and collapsed. But even Russia, which in the 19th century still seemed unshakable, was unable to hold on to its empire. In the year 1917, the long-standing Tsarist imperial regime collapsed, and in the year 1991, the Soviet Union finally completely collapsed and fell apart. The irony is that it was the Austrian Empire, having come to terms with the collapse of its colonial ambitions, that managed to transform itself into a modern European state. Russia, on the other hand, has seemingly failed to learn any meaningful lessons from its own or anyone else's historical experiences, and in the 21st century is persistently attempting to behave as if it's still the 19th century. But the age of empires is over. Today, in an era of globalization and democratic values, empires built on violence and exploitation are doomed. Russia has exhausted its historical role as an empire, but has yet to realize it. It continues to cling to outdated models of violence and expansion, hoping that force will substitute for progress and fear will replace respect. But this is the tragedy of all dying empires. They fail to see that they have long since become a collapsed facade, behind which there are no real opportunities or future left. The Hapsburgs lived through the total collapse of their vast empire, saw other great powers disappear, and clearly understand that Russia is now on that same path. History is relentless. When the final remaining empire of Europe collapses, absolutely no one will come to save its scattered remnants.